Hi, everyone. Good morning, or is it afternoon? It's still morning. So I have the distinct pleasure to talk about bus rapid transit as an expanded mobility option that we're seeing emerging in the global south. It's something that's been happening for decades, and now we're seeing an emergence of it in the United States. I have three distinguished experts that are going to lead us through the discussion. The title of our session is called Sharing the Road, BRT and Global South Urban Mobility. And just to set the context, in recent years, we've seen bus rapid transit pick up considerable momentum, particularly since it was first started in the early 70s with Curitiba, Brazil. What we're now seeing is that we have over 300 BRT corridors across the world, and most of them are in the global south, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. We have some in the global north, mostly in the European countries, and the United States is falling pretty behind. We have approximately 10 BRT, and there's more in the works, but there's more work to be done in the United States. So what this panel is going to spend the next 40 minutes or so exploring is, what is BRT? There are many misconceptions about what a system of bus rapid transit, what it looks like, what are some of the key characteristics. We want to understand what are the benefits that BRT offers, help explore how BRT fits within a larger mobility context, and how you think about building, funding, and expanding BRT based on the location and the geography. So to help us with this conversation, I have Juan Muñoz. He's the Director of Bus Rapid Transit Center for Excellence at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He's worked on bus rapid transit in Latin America, all over the world. He's an author. He has a book on bus rapid transit that will be released in January. He is an entrepreneur, and he focuses on many aspects, not just BRT, but urban mobility. To his right, I have Heather Thompson. She was most recently Interim Executive Director of the Institute for Transportation Development Policy. She helped establish the East Africa Office for ITDP, and ITDP is an organization that helps build bus rapid transit throughout the world. They have been working with the Barr Foundation as partners in Boston, and they are also looking at the nexus between bus rapid transit, urban mobility, transit-oriented development, and pedestrian access. And last but not least, I have Roger Behrens, and he's the director of the African Center for Excellence and Studies in Public and Non-Motorized Transport. Roger's work focuses on bus rapid transit, active transportation, paratransit, in addition to looking at behavioral travel. And so we have three panelists that we're going to start by asking them to say a little bit about their work, give us a bit more context, and then we're going to go deep into the discussion of bus rapid transit and where it works and how we think about advancing it. So why don't I start with you, Carlos?
So thank you very much, Mary. As Mary was saying, I lead this Center of Excellence of Bus Rapid Transit. I'm very interested in making public transport as efficient and solving the mobility needs of everyone in urban areas. I'm also interested not just in BRT, but I also stand as a member of the board in Metro in Santiago, so I play both fits, Metro and buses. This Center of Excellence of Bus Rapid Transit has not just Universidad Católica, but also other institutions, one of them MIT from here, University of Sydney, Barr, and Lisbon. And we tried to address how BRT can really be a great tool for authorities to make cities better, more livable, better quality of life. And we see it from different perspectives, from how do you finance them, how do you design them, how do you operate, how do you control them. And these are all very difficult problems that require a multidisciplinary approach. You cannot do this just looking from, let's say, engineering. It's not an engineering problem, it's an urban problem. And all these elements has to be considered when you're thinking on how to implement this. And we try to do not just research, but also going from the paper to the street, making it happen. And we are, with this Embark network of the World Resources Institute, we do this last step, this last mile of trying to sit with cities and help them make this happen, which is usually a very delicate political issue and needs to be addressed, looking at all the members of the society that will be affected.
Thank you. Heather.
So nice to be here. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for everybody for getting this event together. Just to say a little bit more about ITDP, maybe instead of myself. ITDP is an organization that's been around for 30 years. We're celebrating our 30th year anniversary this year, which we're very excited about. And as Mary said, we do a lot of work, not only on BRT, but on urban planning. And what we really try and focus on is providing technical assistance to city officials that are dealing with planning problems, but also to others that are working in the field. So for example, we have what's called the BRT standard, which gives advice and guidelines on how to build good BRTs. So you can find this resource and many others on our website, including bike sharing guidelines, TOD standard to help with transit-oriented development. But again, what we really focus on is providing technical to city officials and tools for projects around the world, but also really going deep and trying to get demonstration projects done on the ground in countries around the world. So we have 5 offices in Asia, India, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and we have experience in all of those countries of helping city officials. And our goal has been to get a gold standard BRT on every continent, which we're just about accomplished. We still have some work to do here in the US, but we're getting there, so.
Thank you.
Roger. And Roger Behrens from the African Center of Excellence in Transport, which is funded by the Volvo Foundations. We have 3 main collaborating partners. The University of Cape Town, where I'm from, and then universities in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And we focus on main 2 pillars in our research. The first is non-motorized transportation, particularly pedestrians, where African cities have some of the highest fatality rates per 100,000 population on the globe, and there's a number of challenges around making NMT, non-motorized transportation, use safe and efficient. And the second pillar is public transport, and we focus particularly on paratransit and how paratransit might integrate with BRT systems. And in the 3 cities, there's this interesting sequencing of where the cities are in their BRT implementation. So in Cape Town, for instance, we have a BRT system called My City, which started to operate in 2011. In Dar es Salaam, there's a BRT system known as DART, which has been in planning and construction phase for over a decade now, and is imminently, we hope, about to start operating their first services. And then in Nairobi, the planning of BRT corridors has begun. So there's an interesting kind of mix of cases there that we've been looking at.
Great, let's start our conversation. So I think the first question I would like to ask is, let's get to the basics. What is bus rapid transit? Let me start with you, Heather.
Okay. Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with BRT, as we call it, BRT, it's essentially metro, but using buses. And there's lots of ways to design the system, but the pillars of getting it right are to have a dedicated lane for buses so that they can move quickly and stay out of traffic, that those dedicated lanes are in the middle of a road instead of on the side. That allows the passengers to get in and on and off the buses more quickly. Also to have the fare system off board, just like you do in a metro system, so you're not fiddling with money as you get on and off of the bus. You can move a lot more quickly. And then also, just like a metro, that you have level platform boarding, again, to allow passengers to get on and off more quickly. So it's the whole idea of a metro system, but at street level, using buses, but trying to get it to go just as fast as metro. And in the best cases, BRT can carry as many passengers as a metro system would. Some of the great examples are 25,000 passengers an hour in the city of Guangzhou. So, very high capacity systems. But the benefit is they're a lot less expensive to build. They're less than 10% of the cost of metro on average, and they're anywhere to 30 to 60% less than light rail. So a much more cost-effective solution for many cities. And the other great benefit is they're a lot faster to build. Metros take so much time, and we all see the havoc of infrastructure building when you have to dig tunnels and such. But with BRT, it's street level, so the infrastructure development is a lot faster as well.
Thank you. So Juan Carlos, in your work, you've been involved in building BRT all over Latin America. Are there some common characteristics that you see with BRT and where they've been built?
I would like to add in this idea of metronizing the buses, which I think is crucial. If you think of which are the attributes of a metro, you would think that it's usually fast, usually low wait time, not very crowded, and reliable. So the idea here is how do we move from, well, how can we implement those in the case of buses? So you need, for it to be fast, you need to have high speed. For low waiting times, you need high frequency. For not very crowded, high capacity. And for reliability, usually even headways. And the good thing about speed is that if you have speed, the faster you get, the more cycles you can do with the same bus. And therefore, you can have higher frequency and therefore lower waiting time. So speed hits you two, but not only two, a third one also, because if you have more frequency, you have more capacity, and therefore you can move more people. So that's why the focus is bus rapid transit, and that's why everywhere in South America and in everywhere, a very important focus here is how do we make buses move faster. And that's why we need a segregated way, make off-board payment as fast as possible, fast interaction between the bus and the traffic transit signal. A second element is usually you would like buses to be reliable as metro. If you take a metro, you usually know exactly at what time you will arrive to your destination when you leave your home. That's not the case with buses. So we need to move also, make BRT not just rapid, but reliable. We need to BRT to make it bus rapid reliable, BRRT, right? That would be our challenge, I think. And if you make it reliable, waiting times will be lower, and also it will be less crowded because the demand will be better distributed among all buses. So that will be a challenge.
Let's have the conversation about context. Location matters. So Carlos, Juan Carlos, when you talked about making it rapid, that's not always possible in all cities. When I think about Boston, for example, we have those narrow roads. And when we talk to communities about bus rapid transit, they get scared that you're going to have these huge buses that are moving too fast in areas that are highly pedestrianized. Can you talk about ways in which we can mitigate against that? And Roger, I'd like you to speak to that as well.
I totally agree. I mean, the rapidness of buses need to be coherent with the urban context you're moving. There are some areas where definitely you would not like buses running at, let's say, 60 kilometers per hour, 50 kilometers per hour, or in miles 30 or 40. Probably you need something slower, right? But if you want your public transport system to have high capacity and to be attractive, you need it to be fast. And therefore, you need to be very careful in terms of the design on where are you going to make it move fast, where you're going to of course, it has to be, for instance, you have to have a very safe design in terms of pedestrians. In all your intersections, you need to ensure that it's not the bus the one who rules, but certainly the pedestrians. But in our cities, usually what we have is that we have given all the space for cars. And cars are also run very fast, and they are a problem in terms of safety. And what we see everywhere is that when we implement bus rapid transit, even though it's certainly faster than the previous buses, safety in terms of the whole system improves and accidents drop.
Mm-hmm. So Roger, can you say a little bit about how BRT needs to be integrated so that pedestrians still have access and that they're prioritized when we think about mobility?
Sure. I mean, I think with the perception that BRT has, one of the problems was many of the iconic images of the Bogota system after it was started in the early 2000s was these really wide cross sections. And I think a lot of people then associate BRT with that, but it doesn't have to be the case. In some instances, if there's serious conflicts, you can actually remove the cars completely, and there are these busway malls where buses can move cheek by jowl with pedestrians. Of course, then the requirement is that they move a lot slower and that you sacrifice some of those efficiencies. But I think one of the points that I want to make here is that if we look at the human scale problem of some of these corridors, a lot of that space is taken up by general traffic lanes. And I don't think you can necessarily blame the problem solely on the buses. In fact, the allocation of the busways to bus passengers is quite an equitable use of road space. And so I think there's a strong case to actually, if there is a scale problem and a conflict with pedestrians, is to actually remove some of the facilities for private cars, be that removing some of the general traffic lanes or perhaps moving parallel parking along these facilities.
And can you say how you've overcome that challenge, being able to take away parking spaces, being able to take away a car travel lane? What are some ways in which you've overcome those challenges in the countries that you've worked in?
I think it's sort of it's parking.
Yes,
parking is one of the bigger challenges with cities, but we're seeing a lot of interesting things happen. Actually, San Francisco, just across the bay here, is done some great things with removing of parking. And just generally seeing more communities wanting to take back their public space. So I'm sure you have experiences much more these days of going to cities where there are areas that are completely closed off and only for pedestrians. So I think there's more interest and more community activity and demand to take back public space and to take back parking. But also a way that we've been able to get cities to change on parking is that it can become a good revenue source for them. If you eliminate parking, you reduce the supply of parking, essentially your demand goes up and you can begin to charge for pricing. And in an ideal situation, cities will charge for parking and then put that money back into investments in sustainable transportation. So that could be bike sharing programs, it could be BRT, it could be plug-in car zones, and more of the real estate developers who also have limitations on how much parking they can or cannot create in their buildings, they're also preferring to have less parking. It allows them to sell more property and to provide other services that are actually more attractive to their clientele. So if you can get the real estate developers on your side, that often helps to change the mind of cities.
So there's an interesting story in Mexico City around Line 4 in the historic district. Can you say a little bit about that, Juan Carlos?
Yeah, in Mexico City, they have not just this high-capacity BRTs in which buses run really fast, but they also have one line in which it comes from the airport into the Zócalo, which is downtown of Mexico City, going into little streets which are very narrow. But this of course, the speed from which the speed of the buses when they leave the airport is very different from the speed you see around the Zócalo. And this is one of the beautiness also of this kind of transport mode, that it can be adapted into different contexts with the same vehicle, and it can be also very flexible if you need to adapt it in some way. But it's very important, I think, I agree with Heather, this issue of dealing with parking, because parking is not only a bad use of the space, because you have these cars stopped there, preventing other transport modes, other alternatives for this very, very valuable space to move really people, but also it also attracts cars. So by having these cars there, in some way you're saying, we expect you to come here by car. We expect you to bring your congestion and make queues all around by putting your car where you're preventing to add, let's say, a bus lane or a bike lane. So I think this is a conflict that in the US is very, very clear. And I hope that the country understands that by allowing or guaranteeing everyone a parking space, in some way you're preventing the city to move into really a better mobility and accessibility.
So one of the things at the foundation, we have the benefit of being able to get people around the table to have these discussions and reach consensus. What are some good first steps to convince towns, municipalities that are thinking about BRT that they should be giving up parking spaces and travel lanes? What have you done in your respective countries that has worked?
Well, parking might be a more difficult one to answer, but I think there is a stigma around buses. Most people associate the use of buses with poor quality service because historically in most countries that's what it has been. So I think it's been one of the biggest game changers that we've seen at ITDP is taking political leaders to other cities to see a real high quality BRT. And Mexico City is a great example because they have such a variety of fast, dense corridors and some of these city center small areas. But when you can take somebody to see a system, they completely change their mind about what BRT is and how it can function in their area, and usually come back as champions. And then it's the more difficult part of dealing with the communities and whatever sort of transportation informal system might be there. But if you have a political champion with you, it makes all the difference. Again, just a case from San Francisco, I know we had one of the city officials go to Mexico City, and he was totally against BRT, but once he saw the system there, he came back and he's been promoting the system that's hopefully going to start running down Geary Avenue here in San Francisco. So complete game changer.
I think another very important element here is to have a metropolitan authority that is not fragmented. In a lot of places in the world, the city is really divided into little cities in which you have the conflict, because sometimes the BRT will be really good for some people that don't vote exactly where you're implementing the corridor. And that makes it very conflictive, because in some way you need somebody to say this corridor is going to be really, really relevant for people living in the periphery. And by you saying, well, we will not like it because we don't see the benefits, you're preventing the city to move into a better place. So I think this issue of metropolitan authorities, as for instance London has with their Transport for London system, I think it's really beneficial for cities. And I wonder how the Bay Area, for instance, does it when you have a corridor going, I don't know, from Oakland to Berkeley to Albany or whatever. There has to be a metropolitan authority that will take decisions taking care of the whole city.
Right. So when we think about taking care of the whole city and looking at bus rapid transit within the context of other mobility options, can you say a little bit about what you've experienced, Roger, in Africa, and how motorized, non-motorized transport also needs to be part of the equation?
Well, I think Africa is quite an interesting case, and we're not different, but we are certainly towards the edge of this. And one of the problems, I think, has been that the original conceptualization of BRT and the innovations that compounded to produce this technology in places like Curitiba and Bogota was driven largely by the need for bus planners to produce a system that had some of the qualities of metros without building a metro. And so it was always seen as being an alternative to rail investment. And that's where a lot of the academic work is around, is, what are the relative performances of these two systems. And in Africa, that's not really the agenda. It's been introduced in Africa as an alternative, but an alternative to the existing informal paratransit. And therein lies something of the transferability problem. So to come to your question, what we've observed in Africa is a difficulty in getting the existing incumbent operators to buy into the system and to participate in various ways. And I think going forward, that's going to be one of the key policy questions that needs to be dealt with, is how the existing public transport modes can be integrated either as operators or as complementary services.
How has it been done in Africa? And then I want to ask Juan Carlos the same question, or Heather, about Mexico City, because they've had to struggle with this too. How do you take sort of privatized bus service and integrate them into a more formal BRT or transit system? So, Roger? So
there was the first decision was to only deal with the affected operators in the first corridor in the city.
And is this my city in Johannesburg?
This is my city, in Cape Town.
In Cape Town.
Johannesburg followed a different but similar process. Okay. And one of the reasons they chose this corridor is that in the city as a whole, I think there's something like 103 associations. These paratransit informal operators organize themselves in a self-regulatory way into these associations. And there were only 8 of them in this corridor. So one of the reasons the city chose this corridor is because they perceived it to be probably an easier transition to make. And because these associations don't necessarily have the skill sets, the city appointed facilitators. So on the city's budget, people with the 2 main groups of associations appointed them to work with them to go through the process of forming companies. To the point then that they could, as has just happened, sign contracts to run services for the next 12 years.
Okay. Do you want to talk about Mexico City?
Well, I think a very important question here is how do you address incumbent operators that are usually fragmented, that are usually informal, and how do you incorporate foreign experience, which is great. But usually incumbents also have a very well knowledge about the city, about where the demand is. They have developed all the routes. They have some knowledge that shouldn't be dismissed. Yeah. So it's an interesting question on what kind of mixture would you like so that you can bring all these best practices from abroad and at the same time keep what the city already has. In my city, in Santiago, for instance, we were able to bring companies from abroad, and very, very fast, the ones that couldn't make it into this new system and filed bankruptcy because they couldn't fit into this new system were the incumbents. However, after 7 years, those that are operating better are those incumbents that survived. So the survival incumbent is really, really valuable in this renewal process.
Okay. So how do you think about integrating the incumbents into the existing system, recognizing that not all will survive?
It's hard because you need to incorporate in some way this experience into the bidding process, saying, yeah, I realize that you have some value that I would not like to just dismiss, but at the same time make a clear and fair game so that all the bidders have the same opportunity to participate in this process.
So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about what are some of the benefits that you've seen as a result of the BRT corridors that have been built in the countries where you've worked. Let me start with you, Heather.
Well, benefits, they really cross the board from, I think probably what's most important is time savings for people traveling quite often from outside a city into the city center for jobs. And usually the time savings is 50% or more. For example, in the case of Transoeste, which is a BRT that was just built in Rio in Brazil, the travel time for one trip was cut by 40 minutes, so that's about half of a trip. So, an hour and a half a day that mothers and fathers can be with their children and kids can get to school more quickly and more safely. Also, the cost savings are usually dramatic, usually around 50% of a person's cost for a trip per day. And then just adding it all up, again, the costs of BRT are significantly less to implement than metro or light rail, and the benefits are huge. Costs for savings for building roads, maintaining roads, all of the rest. Factor in the trillions of dollars if you add it up around the world. Another huge savings is in terms of emissions, all of the greenhouse gas and air pollution emissions that come from cars, mostly from sitting in traffic. If we can reduce the number of cars and get them to move more quickly, greenhouse gas savings can be huge. Our models say that we can cut greenhouse gases by 25% by 2050 if we move just a fifth of the investment in roads into sustainable transport.
That's huge. Juan Carlos?
The impact of BRT is much more significant if you embed the BRT into the rest of the public transport system. So the goal here is not mobility just for the sake of mobility, but really to make public transport more accessible and more convenient. And for that, you really need the public transport system to work as such, as a system. And I think fair integration in that case, for such a system is crucial, so that you can move from metro to the BRT, eventually to a public bike for the last mile, and make it very convenient for the person that is traveling. And I would like to talk a little bit also about...
You just made me a happy person, because we're talking about this in Boston. How do we think about fair integration?
Yeah.
One system where people can ride every mode of transit that exists.
Yeah, in some cities that they have what they have achieved, and I think it's really valuable in terms of making the whole trip more convenient depending on where people are going. Remember that there's a lot of our public transport users that are in the bottom of the income ladder, and therefore for them paying more than one fare would be really inconvenient, and therefore they will end up walking too much or taking the inconvenient long route just because they cannot pay a second fare. And I think there are some things that needs to be done better in terms of BRT. One thing is very often in the world we design BRTs thinking on a maximum capacity that is not acceptable and not dignifying for the passengers. And I think that that's something that needs to be addressed.
Give us an example where it's been done that way.
Transmilenio in Bogotá. In Transmilenio, I think the system is really, really successful. They move 45,000 passengers per hour per direction with buses. It's amazing. It's really quite an achievement. But the problem is that you end up being a victim of your own success by having so many people that you have crowded stations, crowded buses, and I think there's an issue there on how that you incorporate new buses and lift those bottlenecks. And a problem there is also that the political cycle sometimes gets in the way, because nobody wants in Latin America to raise the kids of your foster father. Right? And therefore, if you implement Transmilenio and the next major comes, we would not be very interested in really improving it very much. So I think that's one of the problems there.
We just have to get the same mayor reelected, which is what we're trying to do in Bogotá now.
Or ensure that it's driven by public need and public interest. So regardless of who's in office, the system can continue to function and be financially supported. Roger, I have a question for you. So in Cape Town and Johannesburg, the BRT was built in preparation for the World Cup, and also in Brazil, some of the corridors in Brazil. How were decisions made about when to do BRT versus when to do rail? How do you think about the hierarchy, or at least making the decisions about which mode is appropriate?
Well, in the South African case, the pressure to get ready for the World Cup actually led to a kind of a truncation of the processes that you would normally follow to make those kinds of decisions. So in fact, there wasn't a particularly thorough alternative analysis. There was a decision that BRT was the way to go. We looked across the pond to Latin America. We saw that cities with similar GDP per capita had been able to do this. They also had the problem of incumbent operators. So there wasn't a systematic decision about rail. But it does, if I may just go back to your earlier question, I think it does raise the question around the benefits. And one of the key issues here has been, particularly for cities that aren't particularly well suited to sustainable public transport systems, of which South African cities, because of the apartheid legacy, are a very good example, and there's an element of that in America as well, is historically one of the arguments for rail has been that the permanence of the track and the stations that can't easily be removed sends a signal to investors that here's a space that you can respond to and you can be certain that those services are going to endure. And the perception of bus has always been that, well, they're very flexible, they're rubber-tied, they can disappear, and overnight the bus route can end. And I think there's interesting evidence starting to emerge that the permanence of the BRT busways and the stations are actually starting to signal the investors in the same way. And in fact, the ITTP, a couple of years ago, I think it was, did a very interesting study focused on the states, I believe, looking at the kind of the land development bang that you get for a buck invested in public transport infrastructure, be it rail or BRT. And I think there have been other studies in South Korea and I think in Colombia as well. So I think there's interesting questions there about the benefits as well that needs to be teased out.
And what that study showed is that the investment in bus rapid transit and light rail are the same. You can get the same, if not more, bang for the buck with BRT investment. So
So I have one question before I open it up to the audience. When we think about innovation and technology around mobility, what lies ahead, particularly when you're looking at BRT? What does the future look like? I'm going to start with you, Roger, and I'll wrap up with Juan Carlos.
Well, if I may give this a particular sort of sub-Saharan African slant to it, I think our early experience of BRT has been both positive and negative. Positive in the sense that we have been able to observe sizable amounts of choice passengers moving from cars into BRT. Negative being that this has come at a huge cost. At the moment, our services, the fare box only recovers about 25% of the total operating cost. So we're having to, in our municipalities, rethink this. How can we make this a sustainable option? And I believe the key to that looking forward is going to be working with the existing operators in a way that perhaps certain portions of what was originally envisaged as being a complete replacement of these operators can continue to be operated by those incumbents. Particularly, for instance, the feeder and the distributor services that connect to the trunk stations. I suspect that's where we're going to be going to make this as an affordable solution.
Okay. Heather?
I would agree with all of that. But just to pick on the particular part of your question around technology, I think when people hear about technology and the future of transportation, most people think about Uber and Lyft and all the car sharing space, which I think is important. But in case of BRT, I think where technology is going to be very interesting is more the integration of the multi-modes. And I'm particularly excited about bicycles. I know it's a technology that we've had for a very long time, but most of the world relies on walking and biking to get to their destination. So the more we can integrate much more sophisticated bike sharing, bike parking, bike systems along with just basic infrastructure for people to ride their bikes and to walk, I think the better all of our public transit systems will get. And the integration is the important thing there too. Thinking about all of the technology that we have now on our phones that allow much smarter, easier fare collection systems. One of the most interesting I think I've seen recently is the M-Pesa system designed in Africa where everybody pays their bills and everything with one system. So you can think about how if people can't buy a smart card because it's too much upfront cost, that they can just use their phone-based M-Pesa system where it's just a little bit out of their account every time. It just makes the access to the system a lot easier and better. So.
Okay, thank you. Juan Carlos, you're next, and then we're going to open it up.
I can think of 3 ideas that I think they're going to happen very soon. One is that we have like 50 or more cities in the world with more than 5 million inhabitants, with people traveling more than 30 kilometers to reach their destination. No BRT will ever, or metro, will be able to solve this problem of giving mobility in less than an hour. So we need to think again on how to structure the city, but also maybe let the BRT conquer the urban freeways. Like we have the freeways, and if we can connect, especially if we have fare integration, if we can connect peripheric places in the city with very fast bus service, that could be really a good element. A second element I would like to address is bus control. Trains never arrive together to a station because they have some certain control mechanisms. Buses do, what is called bus bunching. And this is really bad because instead of having 10 buses per hour, you have 5 buses per hour arriving in couples. And that affects waiting time, reliability, comfort. So we need to have, and that's something we've been implementing in Chile, a device next to the driver saying speed up or slow down so that to keep the buses regularly spaced. And the last one, it's very interesting, I think, is automated buses without a driver or with a driver that doesn't drive. And in corridors, this is very, very possible because you have a lot of sensors, you're always moving forward, and you will be able to have a much closer boarding between the bus and the station. You'll be much more safer. You'll be able to reach schedules and have a better control. So I see automated buses running in some of our cities in the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow, that's really scaling up autonomous vehicles. Let's take some questions. Questions over here.
Yeah. I'm Leticia from Rio de Janeiro. I'd like to comment on two things related to BRTs. There are 4 BRT lines being constructed in Rio since last year because of the World Cup and the Olympics, and there are 2 major problems with them. First, that most of them were not constructed based on demand. So they were constructed just to serve the Olympics. So it's to take people from the airport to the Olympic Park, and also to build the new centralities that the Olympic venues are being bring to some areas where there are interests of the real estate investment. And the second is that BRT is being used to displace people massively, because not all the roads that were conducive for a dedicated lane. So in some cases, they had to build a new lanes, and they are using a BRT as an excuse to displace people. One of the BRTs would have impacted more than 2,000 families, but then they managed to discuss with the municipality, and they could change the itinerary. I'm not blaming the BRT per se. Of course, I think it's a good alternative, and ITDP is Ford Foundation partner in Rio, and they are doing a very great job. What I'm saying is that when these BRTs are implemented, they have to be done in a way that a more wide public policy should be seen around that. Housing, access to jobs, and other things that they are really bring a advantage to the population.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond to that? Heather.
Please.
I think, well, Rio de Janeiro is working, I think, at the very frontier of the new BRTs. We have this Transcarioca going from Galeão, the airport, crossing the city, and I think in a very beautiful and subtle way of going through a delicate urban place. I agree with you that sometimes BRTs are implemented in places where nobody wants to go. Like it's like, why are we doing it here? Because just a way of showing what the BRT can be. I think it's a little bit of what happened in Rio de Janeiro at the beginning. But the new corridors, I think, are being able to address really a lot of mobility. Indeed, one of the few new corridors that is being tested or is being built will increase the number of passengers per hour that Bogota can move. They claim that they will be able to move around 60,000 passengers per hour per direction, because it will go in the middle of a freeway, via Dutra. So it's very attractive in that sense. And I agree with you that we need to build them where the demand is. Regarding the urban impact, yes, it's certainly something we need to be very careful. But very often there's no alternative but sometimes to expropriate a little bit of land to make room for the buses, especially when the authority doesn't have the courage to take that space directly from cars, which I think is what needs to be done most of the case.
And I think one of the important points to highlight is that when we're thinking about building BRT, to ask the question, who's it being built for? What is the legacy that BRT will have after a game or an Olympic or a World Cup? Question back here?
Yeah, Greg DeLon with the Global Urban Innovation Exchange. Really on a similar note, you mentioned that in South Africa, you're getting 25% of the fares is paying for the overall cost. And really broadening this discussion, whether it be about access to bike mobility and broader systematic city discussions of development, as opposed to falling into the siloed trap of just transit, but really expanding to broad-based return on investment that is also return on social investment, and to the extent that that's really helping you all to justify these sorts of investments that are a much better return on investment than something like light rail.
Okay, so we're going to hold answers to that question, take the second question, and then we may need to wrap up. I hear Gordon looking at me. Okay, perfect.
Hi, David Leipziger. I'm a graduate student at UCLA. In Los Angeles, they've tried to implement what they call BRT, but which doesn't have a dedicated lane and therefore is relatively unsuccessful. And I think that can be converted from, they don't want to take it away from traffic. I think that it can be taken away because there are many alternatives for commuters. There's a lot of work flexibility, and Los Angeles is a city that can support that. But my question is, in other cities, particularly in countries in sub-Saharan Africa or other places where there's not as much of a developed road network, where there are fewer commute alternatives, where there's less working flexibility, is it always a good idea to take away a lane of traffic for people who might not have any other options? Thank you.
So the two outstanding questions we have is, how do you think about return on investments beyond financial? And then how do you think about developing real BRT, particularly in places where it may not meet some of the standards? So as you can tell, this is a really rich conversation. There's a lot more we could discuss around BRT. Roger, Heather, and Juan Carlos will be here during the break, and I encourage you to come up and speak to them. But thank you so much for your time. This has been fun.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Yeah.